Siberia. On the bank of a wide, lonely river, there is a town, one of Russia's administrative centres. In the town there is a fortress, in the fortress a prison. In the prison there is a penal exile of the second category, Rodion Raskolnikov. Since the day he committed his crime, almost 1.5 years have passed. The legal processing of this case went through without much difficulty. The criminal backed up his deposition with firmness, precision and clarity, neither confusing any of the circumstances nor making any attempt to soften them in his favour. Distorting no facts, leaving out not the slightest detail. He described the entire plan of the murder right down to the smallest minutiae, cleared up the mystery of the pledge, the small flat piece of wood with the metal flange, that was found in the hands of the murdered old woman, narrated in detail how he had removed the keys from the dead woman's person, described those keys, described the trunk and what had filled it, even enumerated some of the individual items it had contained, cleared up the riddle of Lizaveta's murder, recounted how Koch had come up the stairs and knocked, followed by the student, describing everything they had said to each other. How he, the criminal, had then run down the stairs and heard the shouting of Mikolka and Mitka, how he had hidden in the empty apartment and then gone back to his own lodgings. And in conclusion gave the whereabouts of the block near the gate in the yard of Voznesensky Prospect, under which the goods and the purse were found. In short, the case was cut and dried. The investigators and the judges were, it must be said, very surprised that he should have hidden the purse and the goods under the block without availing himself of them. And even more so that not only was he unable to remember the details of any of the goods he had stolen, but was even mistaken as to their number. In particular, the fact that he had never once opened the purse, did not even know how much money it contained, seemed difficult to believe. The purse had turned out to contain 317 silver roubles and 23 kopeck pieces. Because of the long time they had spent under the block, some of the banknotes, on top, which bore the largest denominations, had suffered severe water damage. Much time was spent in attempting to discover why it was that the defendant should be lying about this one thing, while he had voluntarily and truthfully confessed to everything else. At last, 1 or 2 members of the panel, especially the psychologists, actually admitted the possibility that he really had never looked inside the purse, and so had not known what it contained, and that in this state of ignorance he had put it under the block. But at that point it was concluded that the crime itself could only have been committed in a state of some temporary disturbance of the mind, as it were, under the influence of some dangerous monomania involving murder and robbery for murder and robbery's sake, without ulterior motive or thought of gain. This decision happened to coincide with the arrival of the latest fashionable theory of temporary insanity, the application of which to certain criminals is so frequently the object of such effort in our time. What was more, precise testimony to Raskolnikov's inveterate hypochondria was adduced by many of the witnesses, among them Dr. Zosimov, Raskolnikov's ex-student colleagues, his landlady and serving-maid. All this did much to reinforce the conclusion that Raskolnikov was not at all the usual kind of murderer, brigand and robber, and that here they were faced with something rather different. To the great annoyance of those who supported this opinion, the criminal made practically no attempt to defend himself. In response to the final and deciding questions as to what had induced him to murder and what had made him commit robbery, he replied quite succinctly, with the most brutal precision, that the cause of the whole thing had been his rotten social position, his poverty and helplessness, and his desire to secure the first steps of his career with the help of at least 3,000 roubles, which he had counted on finding in the home of the murdered woman. As for the murder, He had embarked upon it as a result of his frivolous and cowardly nature, which had, moreover, been overwrought by deprivation and failure. To the question as to what had prompted him to turn himself in, he replied bluntly that it had been genuine remorse. All this was almost indecent. The sentence, however, turned out to be more lenient than might have been supposed, given the crime that had been committed. And this may have been for the reason that not only did the criminal make no attempt to justify himself, he seemed even to display a wish to incriminate himself further. All the strange and unusual circumstances of the case were taken into account. As to the criminal's ill and impoverished condition before he had committed his crime, there was not the slightest doubt. The fact that he had not availed himself of the proceeds of the robbery was put down in part to the influence of awakening remorse, and in part to an impaired condition of his mental faculties during the enactment of the crime. The fact of Lizavetta's unexpected murder merely served as an example to reinforce this latter supposition. A man commits 2 murders, yet forgets the door is open. And to cap it all, he turns himself in at the very point when the case has grown extraordinarily complicated as a result of the false self-incrimination of a depressed fanatic, Nikolai. And this at a time when not only is there no clear evidence against the real criminal, but there is hardly any suspicion of his guilt. Porfiry Petrovitch fully kept his promise. All of this played a decisive role in softening the fate of the accused man. In addition to this, there also appeared, quite unexpectedly, certain other circumstances that acted powerfully in the defendant's favour. The former student Razumikin dug up from somewhere the information, supporting it with proof, that the criminal Raskolnikov had, during the period of his attendance at the university, helped, with the last of his resources, a certain poor and consumptive student colleague of his acquaintance, having more or less kept him alive for a 6-month spell. Not only that, but following his death, he had looked after the old and enfeebled father, now left among the living, of his deceased colleague, who had supported and sustained his father by his own labour very nearly from the age of 13. He had, what was more, found the old man a place in a hospital, and when he too had died, had arranged his funeral. All this information exercised a certain favourable influence on the decision of Raskolnikov's fate. Then again, no less a person than his former landlady, the widow Zarnitsnya, the mother of his deceased fiancée, testified that when he had been living in another building at 5 Corners, Raskolnikov had, during a fire in the middle of the night, dragged 2 small children to safety from one of the apartments that was already in flames, and had suffered burns as a result. This piece of evidence was thoroughly investigated and rather well supported by the testimony of many of the witnesses. In short, the upshot was that the criminal was sentenced to penal servitude of the 2nd category for a period of only 8 years in all, in recognition of his having turned himself in, and in view of certain circumstances that had reduced his guilt. Right at the start of the trial, Raskolnikov's mother became ill. Dunya and Razumikin found a means of getting her out of St. Petersburg for the entire duration of the trial. Razumikin selected a town situated on the railway and within easy reach of St. Petersburg, so he would have an opportunity of keeping a proper eye on all the details of the trial, and at the same time be able to see Avdotya Romanovna as frequently as possible. Pulcheria Alexandrovna's illness was of some strange nervous kind, and was accompanied by something close to insanity. If not complete, then at least partial. Dunya, on returning from her last meeting with her brother, had found her mother thoroughly ill, with a fever and delirium, and that very evening she had come to an agreement with Razumikin as to what they should tell her mother in response to her questions about her brother, and had even invented with him a whole story about Raskolnikov's departure for some distant spot on the frontiers of Russia on a certain private errand that would eventually bring him both money and fame. They were, however, struck by the fact that neither on that occasion nor on subsequent ones did Pulcheria Alexandrovna ask any questions at all. Quite the reverse. She herself was full of some story about her son's sudden departure. With tears, she described to them how he had come to say farewell to her. Let it be known as she did so, by means of hints, that she alone was privy to a great number of very important and mysterious circumstances, and that Roger had a great many powerful enemies, making it positively essential for him to go into hiding. With regard to his future career, it seemed to her that it would be brilliant and assured, once certain hostile circumstances had been got out of the way. She made it quite plain to Razumikin that she considered her son would in time become a statesman, something that was proven by his article and his dazzling literary talent. And this article was something that she read constantly, sometimes even reading it out loud, very nearly sleeping with it at her side. But for all that, she almost never asked where exactly Roger was now, even in spite of the fact they all too obviously avoided mentioning the subject to her, which alone ought to have alerted her suspicion. In the end, they began to be frightened by the strange silence of Pulcheria Alexandrovna on certain points. For example, she never even complained about not getting any letters from him, while earlier, when living in her little town, she had done nothing but live in the hope and expectation of the speedy receipt of a letter from her adored Rodia. This latter circumstance really seemed to defy explanation and caused Dunya no end of worry. She had been visited by the idea that her mother must have had a premonition of something dreadful that awaited her son, and was afraid to ask any questions, lest she should discover something even more dreadful. Whatever the truth of the matter, Dunya clearly perceived that Pulcheria Alexandrovna was not in a sound condition of mind. On one or two occasions, however, it chanced that Pulcheria Alexandrovna herself steered the conversation in such a manner that it would have been impossible in replying to her not to mention the place where Roger now found himself. And when the replies could not help coming out, like it or not, with a hollow, suspicious ring to them, she suddenly grew thoroughly mournful, silent and downcast, a state of affairs that continued for a very long time. In the end, Dunya saw that all this lying and invention was more trouble than it was worth, and she came to an inevitable conclusion that it would, on certain points, be better for her to remain completely silent. It was, however, growing transparently clear that her poor mother suspected some dreadful thing. Among much else, Dunya recalled her brother's remark that Pulcheria Alexandrovna had overheard the words she had uttered in her delirium the night before that last fateful day following her scene with Svidrigailov. What if she had been able to make some of them out? Frequently, sometimes after several days and even weeks of downcast, gloomy silence and speechless tears, the sick woman would spring into a kind of hysterical life and suddenly begin to talk out loud, almost incessantly, about her son, her hopes, her future. Her imaginings were sometimes very strange. They played along with her, said yes to her and everything. It was probable that she saw all too clearly that this was what they were doing, yet still she went on talking. 5 months after the criminal had turned himself in, his sentence was delivered. Razumikin went to see him in prison whenever this was possible. So also did Sonia. At last the hour of parting drew near, and Dunya swore to her brother that this parting was not forever. So also did Razumikin. In Razumikin's young and excitable head there firmly took root the project of creating in the course of the next 3 to 4 years at least the beginnings of an eventual fortune, of scraping together some money and moving to Siberia, where the soil was rich in every respect, but there was a shortage of workmen, farm hands, and capital, of settling in the same town where Roger would be, and of them all beginning a new life together. As they said farewell, they all wept. And during those very last days, Raskolnikov was extremely broody, asked frequent questions about his mother, constantly worried about her. In fact, he positively tormented himself about her, a fact which made Dunya anxious. Having learned in detail of his mother's disturbed state of mind, he became very gloomy. For some reason, during all this time, he had been particularly unforthcoming in the presence of Sonia. With the help of the money that had been left to her by Svidrigailov, Sonia had long ago made up her mind and got herself ready to follow the gang of convicts with which he too was to be dispatched. Not a word concerning this had ever been mentioned between her and Raskolnikov. Both knew, however, that this was how it was going to be. At the time of their last farewell, he had smiled strangely at the fervent assurances of his sister and of Razumikin about the happy future they would have together when he had finished his penal servitude, and had prophesied that his mother's unhealthy condition would soon end in calamity. At last he and Sonia set off. 2 months later, Dunya and Razumikin were married. The wedding was a sad and quiet affair. Among the guests, it may as well be said, was Porfiry Petrovitch and Zosimov. Throughout all this latter period, Razumikin wore the air of a man who has taken a firm resolve. Dunya had a blind faith that he would realize all his intentions, and it would have been hard for her to see him otherwise. This man displayed an iron will. Among other things, he began to attend university lectures again in order to be able to complete his course. Both of them spent practically every moment putting together plans for the future. Both firmly intended to move to Siberia in 5 years' time. Until that day, they were relying on Sonia's being there. Pulcheria Alexandrovna gave her blessing to the marriage with joy. After it, however, she seemed to grow even sadder and more worried. In order to afford her a pleasant moment, Razumikin informed her, among other things, of the episode concerning the student and his senile father, and of the fact that Roger had sustained burns and even fallen ill after rescuing 2 little children from certain death the year before. Both pieces of news had the effect of sending the already unbalanced Pulcheria Alexandrovna into a state bordering upon frenzy. She talked about this ceaselessly, would even engage passers-by in the street to tell them about it, although Dunya never left her side. In public carriages, in shops, wherever she could capture a listener of whatever kind, she'd lead the conversation to the subject of her son, to the article he had published, to his having helped a student and suffered burns in a fire, and so on and so forth. Poor Dunya did not know how to stop her. In addition to the danger inherent in this morbid and frenetic mood, there was also the threat of disaster involved in the possibility that someone might recall the name Raskolnikov in connection with the recent court case and begin talking about it. Pulcheria Alexandrovna even discovered the address of the mother of the 2 little children who had been saved from the fire, and wanted to go and visit her without fail. At last her agitation reached extreme proportions. She would, on occasion, begin to weep, was frequently ill, and talked wildly in her fever. One morning she announced straight out that, according to her estimates, Roger would soon be back again, that she remembered him telling her, as he had said good-bye to her, that she should expect him at the end of 9 months. She began to tidy the apartment and made ready to greet him, began to make some finishing touches to the room she had designated for him, her own, clean the furniture, wash new curtains, hang them up, and so on. Dunya grew alarmed, but did not say anything, even helped to set the room up ready to receive her brother. After a troubled day, spent in constant imaginings, in joyful daydreams and tears, at night she fell ill, and by morning already had a high temperature and delirium. A dangerous fever had set in. 2 weeks later, she died. The words that escaped her lips during her delirium made it clear beyond any doubt that she suspected far more concerning the terrible fate of her son than anyone had supposed. It was a long time before Raskolnikov found out that his mother had died, even though he established a correspondence with St. Petersburg right at the very beginning of his life in Siberia. This correspondence was arranged by Sonia, who punctually every month sent a letter to St. Petersburg in Razumikin's name, and punctually each month received an answer back. Dunya and Razumikin had initially found Sonia's letters rather dry and unsatisfactory, but they eventually arrived at the conviction that no better account could be desired, because as a result of these letters they obtained a most complete and precise idea of the fate of their unhappy brother. Sonia's letters were full of the most ordinary, everyday details, and gave a most simple and clear description of Raskolnikov's life in penal servitude. They contained no statement of her own hopes, nor any suppositions about the future, or descriptions of her own feelings. In place of attempts to throw light on his mental condition and inner life in general, there were nothing but facts. His own words, that is, in the form of news concerning the state of his health, what he had asked for at such and such a meeting, what he had requested from her, what he had asked her to do for him, and the like. All this news was imparted in extremely thorough detail. Eventually the image of their unhappy brother emerged of its own accord in a precise and vivid silhouette. Here there could be no error, for it was all true fact. There was, however, little comfort to be extracted by Dunya and her husband from this news, particularly at the outset. Sonia constantly reported that he was in a state of unbroken gloom, had hardly anything to say for himself, and showed an almost complete lack of interest in the news she brought him, fresh each time from the letters she had received. That he sometimes asked about his mother, and when at last, realizing that he had already guessed the truth, she told him of his mother's death, much to her surprise, not even that piece of news seemed to have any particular effect on him, or at least that was the way it appeared to her on the outside. She related, among other things, that even though he was so plainly absorbed in himself and seemed to have closed himself off from everyone, he viewed his new life in a very simple and straightforward manner, that he had a clear understanding of his position, expected nothing better near to hand, had no frivolous hopes, something very common among people in his situation, and was more or less astonished, or unastonished rather, by his new surroundings, which were so little similar to anything he had known previously. She told them that his health was satisfactory. He performed the work he was required to do, neither trying to evade it nor approaching it with undue eagerness. That was as to food, he was more or less indifferent to it, but that this food, except on Sundays and feast days, was so abominable that in the end he gladly accepted a small sum of money from her in order to be able to brew tea for himself each day. But that as far as everything else was concerned, he had asked her not to trouble herself, assuring her that all these worries on his behalf were merely a source of annoyance to him. Sonia went on to relate that he shared living quarters with all the rest, that she had not seen the interior of their barracks, but assumed that they were cramped, nasty, and insanitary, that he slept on a plank bed with a piece of felt underneath him, and did not intend to seek any other accommodation, but that the life he was leading was so crude and impoverished, not because of any preconceived plan or intention, but simply because of his lack of engagement and his apparent indifference to his fate. Sonia made no bones about the fact that, particularly at the outset, he had not only showed little interest in her visits, but had almost lost his temper with her, had refused to say very much, and had even crudely insulted her, but that, eventually, these meetings had become a habit for him, and even a necessity, with the result that he was plunged into gloom when for several days she was ill, and unable to visit him. She wrote that her meetings with him on Sundays and feast days took place by the prison gate or in the guardroom, whither he was summoned into her presence for a few minutes, but that on the other days of the week she visited him at his work, either in the workshops, at the brick factory, or in the alabaster sheds on the bank of the Irtish. For herself, Sonia informed them that she had actually managed to acquire a few contacts and patrons in the town, that she worked as a seamstress, and since the town was practically deficient in milliners, she had in many households become a positive necessity. The only thing she omitted to mention was that through her Raskolnikov had also received a certain degree of patronage from the authorities, that he had been given a reduced workload and so on. Eventually the news came, Dunya noted a particular agitation and uneasiness in her letters, that he was estranged from everyone, that the other convicts in the prison did not like him, that for days on end he said nothing, and was growing very pale. Suddenly, in her final letter, Sonia wrote that he had been taken very seriously ill and was in hospital, in the convicts' ward there.